So tonight's presentation, like Tim mentioned, is going to be the past, present, and the future. There were multiple source documents that I went through, especially with documents that were sourced from the mid-1800s. There is some inconsistency on dates comparing those sources. So if there is an inconsistency on any dates that I present, I will make it known and hopefully come across as accurate as possible some of those documents. Now, that being said, the records keeping during that time and during the time, basically the past of the mill pond is somewhat sporadic. So I have filled in as much information as I possibly could with the source documents I had. And with that being said, a huge help was Robin Unz from the Aslan Historical Society. So she provided many source photos, provided background to the photos, most of which were not dated, but her and I were kind of able to roughly track down the approximation of when some of these photos were taken and when we can assume some of these events happened. So I will present it as accurately as possible, and if you have any questions, please ask along the way for clarification. And I will say this is probably some of the most fun I've had putting together a presentation because I am an absolute local history nerd, so this is very much fun for me. So that being said, I'm going to start with basically the formation of the mill. Without the mill being formed, we would not have the mill pond. The mill pond is, for the most part, artificially created through the construction of the mill. So that being said, Captain Joseph Keyes, if you are not familiar, is the first resident and founder of Lake Mills. Settled in Lake Mills in 1837 and originally traveled from Milwaukee through Aztalan, and he did have the initial goal of making an area of commerce. He wanted to be able to create an area where commerce could grow because what we were actually on was the territorial road. That territorial road existed between Milwaukee and Madison. Basically what we have now, we have an interstate highway system from Milwaukee to Madison. So he did come basically with the intent to have create commerce because we both have the Rock River and the Crawfish River junctions here, of which is a pretty substantial source of lumber transportation.
Eric?
So, yes, sir.
District orientation, that view is north.
Yep, so where we're looking right now, the mill, what is pictured there just over that actual culvert, or I suppose tunnel, that is Main Street. So that is actually on the north side of Main Street. That mill exists where the current spillway is in front of Legion Post 67. If you recall, there is actually a metal art sculpture over that spillway representing the actual water wheel of a mill that is representatory of the mill that used to stand in that location. So just for bearings, I'll point out bearings as accurately as I can for some of these photos, but that would be, I don't know, approximately at the corner of Lake and Main Street looking at that location.
Okay.
So, that being said, one of the inconsistencies that I did have of dates was the actual potential creation of the mill. I had one source citing 1847. The one that I actually do trust more, and I apologize for not getting it in the presentation, was the creation of the sawmill in 1839. So the initial sawmill was created because you cannot create structures without a source of lumber. Since there was lumber transportation or raw lumber transportation through the Rock and Crawfish rivers, the sawmill was created at that location. There were besides a water wheel that was there weren't any other dam structures or anything like that. All they used was the actual power of the water flowing from the mouth of where Rock Lake is, where the half-circle bridge is on Bartles Beach, through to where we have the dam now. So they used that Rock Creek running through as a source for power. There initially was not a pond there, it was just the flowing of that Rock Creek. This was expanded with the addition of a more substantial water wheel in 1842, of which the grist mill was created. The grist mill was basically exactly what you think. It was made to grind flour, other products, etc., just to provide more opportunities for sales from that location. So I have the approximation of 1839 to 1842 is when it was created. 1847 is the date that I found that actually goes further a little bit, when there were updates constructed on the mill itself. One of the interesting things that I did find up as well is Joseph Keyes did coin the name Lake Mills. They were standing at a location, and they were determining a potential name for the community. Joseph Keyes apparently made the statement of, "For there's the lake, and here are the mills," is what he actually stated, and that's how the town actually created its name, and that was from his daughter, Alicia Keyes, at the time. So, for one of the sources that I do have, it was a book written in 1911 from the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Tyranina chapter. The mill property existed and ran by Joseph Keyes until he took a postmaster position, at which point it was actually sold to the Pickett and Millard families of the community in 1843, who continued to operate it as Keyes took his new position as local postmaster. Mill updates were completed in 1847, and that's, I think, where that additional date is referenced in a couple other sources as well. But I do believe that the mill was created before 1847. It's just when there are substantial updates to either the power system. In 1843, the Rock Creek Dam, so there was actually a dam that was in place, and that dam is actually just timbers that they removed per seasonal floods, most likely in springtime. It was just a series of lumber, pieces of lumber that were at the junction of Rock Lake and Rock Creek, like I referenced at Bartles Beach. So that's where the initial dam was. That was actually moved from that mouth of the channel with Rock Lake west towards in front of the mill. So there was a water control structure that was put there west of the mill, east of that channel, my mistake. And this was actually
just make sure you're listening.
Yes. And that was used to better control water flow. So many people would state that they're trying to keep a consistent power flow to the mill, the water wheel moving with actual dam structures in place closer to the mill. They were able to do that and have more consistent water flow for power. At this point in 1843 is the first documented instance to where the Rock Creek was dredged from the Rock Lake to the actual power wheel itself. And I think that's more basically just to, again, allow a more consistent flow of water to the wheel.
What was that year again?
1843. So it's the first documented instance from I could tell of dredging, and that would be from what exists now as the channel to the dam would be the same instance currently.
And was it the actual pond at that point, or was it more of just a small channel type of thing?
So here's where I'll go through a little bit more. I can scroll through here. Perfect. So at this time, there was no pond. This was just an actual stream flowing from the Rock Lake through, so it existed as Rock Creek. There's been no mention of any pond through that time in 1843. So through, let me see here.
So, okay, hold on. So Rock Creek flowed all the way through where the mill pond is now, but there wasn't a pond to
Correct.
Rock Lake.
Yep.
And it exited at the same point, do you think?
From what I can tell, yes. Now, further dates, we can reference the shoe factory here as well. The shoe factory does have sections underneath it to where water flows underneath it. So from all sources that I can tell, it was basically a constant channel of flowing water from Rock Lake through the actual mill itself and down into Rock Creek. So
When I said exited, it's actually entering.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what I found, though, was the first instance to where I found the potential creation of what was referenced as a pond. In September 9th of 1897, there was actually a Lake Mills Leader article, and like I said, this shows the first instance to where it's not just mentioned as a creek, but a somewhat flooded area that leads to the potential formation of a pond. So from here, this was the second instance or circumstance of dredging that I could find was in 1897. The goal of this dredging was to eliminate a pond from forming because the area started to become saturated, fill in with marsh grasses, and basically start to form a pond. And this is restricting property owners. Basically, their property was becoming saturated with water. And at that point, they did want to maintain, again, that more consistent water flow through to the mill. And this is likely the second instance of documented dredging that I could find.
Is this, again, Eric, is this looking east to west or west to east?
So where we are right now is this is actually going to be, from what I can tell, on the shores of Bartles Beach, looking eastward towards where Main Street would be. So if you guys are property owners on Mill Pond, I do believe that your properties are referenced on the left side of the photo where the trees are. There's an excerpt from that article, which I would like to read, which kind of does describe the actual thought process behind the dredging and why they actually wanted to eliminate the saturated area and formation of the pond itself. So this is from that Lake Mills Leader article. I'm not sure who the actual creditor is as far as saying this, but it is referenced in that article. So adjacent property owners and the mill owner will lower the creek bed so as to give the mill 5 feet more head. What they mean by head is you're going to have 5 feet more depth of water, basically from the base of the actual creek itself to the top of the water. Lowering of the creek bed to extend from the mill downstream far enough to secure perfect drainage. This will be a great improvement viewed from more than one standpoint. It will give a more active flow to the water, consequently a more certain removal of all accumulations. It will give the property owner sufficient fall, which is decreased water level, to do proper draining, and thus take away stagnant water from their lands, and the result must inevitably be a better security against those diseases which arise from the malaria vapors which rise from lands which are low and too moist. So this does kind of date the document quite a bit. Their worries here currently was the development of stagnant waters forming above the dam or water control structure itself. Lastly, this continues the actual quote from that document. In a direct way to some and in an indirect way to others, it will be an advantage to every citizen in town, and the promoters deserve the thanks of all our citizens. So some of the assumptions, or at least conclusions that I drew finding that article, is for one, it was the first instance to where I see a non-constantly flowing stream of water and referencing a stagnant or formation of an actual pond. And that's kind of what I assumed from that article from 1897. So the area from the dam or mill and the mouth of Rock Lake had created this marshy area and buildup of sediments, and the permeating of water onto the banks restricted water flows through Rock Creek. And like I said, this is the first instance that I can find the potential creation of a pond. So if I move forward a little bit more, from that article in 1897 to approximately the early 1900s, and with this document that I'm referencing here on the presentation, 1915 is the first drawing that I could find actually representing a substantial body of water called the Mill Pond. So from 1897, when they did that second dredge, after that second dredge until 1915 is when we can assume the Mill Pond in theory was created. What I think at that point is basically the non-continued operation or non-constant operation of the mill itself. The mill was declining in use throughout that time and changing through a handful of different owners throughout that time period. And in 1930s photo, which that photo that showed the watercraft looking at Bartles Beach, that was approximately 1934. So from 1897 to 1915, we have the development of what is drawn here as the Mill Pond. And then from 1915, referencing this document to that previous photo, it started being used for recreational purposes. Hopefully that kind of makes sense, at least coming along this point. So this is definitely the first instance that I can see of a true reference to Mill Pond. So to give you guys the bearings, you can actually see what is the channel on the north end of this drawing, right where it says lake. That would be the Bartles Beach seawall. That channel going through that small strip is what we now have existing as the channel. We have our Mill Pond being referenced, and then if you go all the way south to where it says Main Street and crosses, that small little box on Main Street there, that would be the existing mill and dam that was moved there subsequently. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of bearing. The top of that map would be west, the right of it would be north.
So, Oh, Eric, I was going to jump in, and if you're going to get to this, stop me. But it looks like we see here to the, well, what would be south of the mill pond, if you oriented this the right way,
Yep, correct.
would be, looks like residential development. And what I know from speaking with Greg Haglund previously is that development was proposed and then stopped by the DNR. Are you going to get
Yep.
into that at all?
That's exactly what this slide is.
Okay.
So, perfect. So this gives us the representation here.
Did you want to?
So we have the instance here to where we do have the development of the drawing of the mill pond. And if you see the dotted line on the left side of this drawing is what was labeled as marsh area or edge of swamp. So my assumptions here is that's what would be considered our marshy saturated grassland area or wetland area with our cattails. And then we have our water body on the right, which would be our mill pond. Now, it was proposed to fill this area and create residential development along it, basically creating a channel between what was going to be Ferry Drive and what is Main Street. What exists there now currently is our marshy area along Veterans Lane near the firehouse through Ferry Drive.
Eric, are the spots that are dark with no numbers on, is that water? And then like there's little bridges, is that what we're looking at? Like,
What I'll do is I'll take my cursor here. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor. So this is the actual border of the water body, the mill pond itself. It does extend beyond these numbers. And this dotted line here is what exists as the marshy area. And that's what was proposed to be filled, creating residential lots, each of these being an individual lot that would be placed in that filled area.
and so just below your cursor, that's water.
Looks like
This is
there's
marsh
channels.
area. Yep, this is
No.
marsh area.
But
see
then
what-
below that,
no,
there's
see, I
properties
think
on Main.
This area?
No, I think those are lots. I
Yeah.
think, here's the water, I think this is
Oh,
water.
so-
I think this is designed to be water so people have access to.
Yes, correct. And now that did not exist. That was a proposed development.
Okay.
Yep. So this separate channel did not exist at the time. It was proposed that sorry, I misunderstood your question, but it was proposed that this would be an extra channel providing water to these residences. But at the time, this dotted line is what represents our basically perimeter of our marsh area. Very similar layout actually to what we see now if we go to our aerials. But that, yes,
Refresh my memory on the date this was drawn.
1915. So the gap that I do kind of have, I would definitely love to find an earlier source of referencing the mill pond prior to just being a flooded rock creek. And that's that difficulty in area where I wasn't able to find too much source information from 1897 to 1915. But yes, this was proposed, this was removed as far as actually potentially operating. I don't believe it was the DNR at the time, but I actually look up what governing body it really was or what department it was, but it was also not the Wisconsin Conservation Department either. It preceded that, but it was shot down for development in that area.
Is there any detail that you found as to what the depth of these?
I was not able to find the depth of the mill pond itself. So what we have here, this is again, I believe this is from the same photographer. They look very similar from that other reference photo from 1934. Robin assisted a little bit. We are assuming that this is 1934. So that time period from 1915 to 1934, the mill pond is established. It is being used as recreation. People are boating through the channel from Rock Lake. They are using the mill pond as boating and fishing access. And what we have here is, this is basically, from what I could tell, closer to Ferry Drive. I don't know if this is quite prior to an actual Ferry Drive bridge being constructed, but this would be similar to where basically our culvert exists now that separates the channel. So in the background here, if you look where my cursor is, you would see the southern perimeter of the marsh grasses here that were previously referenced, and actually left of here would be the remainder of your actual water body, being the mill pond.
So you think this image is from the lake in or from the pond?
This would be basically mid-channel looking into the mill pond is what I could tell. I do believe there's more channel that exists beyond the actual photographer, but we do believe that this would be from 1934 as previously in the other photo. And I can go back as well, that's fine to me to reference this other photo. So this is the photo as well. The colors were slightly different, but they did come from the same source, and that was dated 1934. So the previous picture that we looked at with the bridge would basically be to the right of this photo. So this would be standing on the shores of Bartles Beach looking into the mill pond.
I can see why you had fun.
I had a fantastic time, honestly. So here we see our marsh grasses. If we go back to this photo again, we have majority coverage of lily pads, but we do have unrestricted water travel access along this corridor. This would go towards the actual mill itself, which would be at this location, where my cursor is here.
Do we have any idea, Eric, as to which month this was? Because it looks like it's September or August, a late.
Yeah,
It was
assumption summer at some point.
Yeah.
We just have an approximation of 1934. These individual photos were not dated, however, they were along other photos that were dated from the same source, and it was 1934. So again, I'll reference this photo as well. So from that photo, actually I'll go back here. In this photo, you see these are just natural shorelines along the channel itself. There were those two dredgings that were done previously that I mentioned. It's my assumption here as well that this was dredged beyond that time frame, but non-documented. But there is not any shoreline erosion control methods. All we have is just natural vegetation. This is prior to the development of Bartles Beach Park. And you definitely see a fairly substantial widening of this channel itself. Now, if I go forward, this is the actual creation of the true channel between Rock Lake and the mill pond. At the same time, this is when the dam was actually built at its existing location that it is now. It was a concrete structure similar to what we had previously, where boards were removed to control water, but the mill was no longer in operation. That mill was sold to the city approximately around that 1934 time frame, and that marsh area, as well as the, mill pond itself, became a portion of city property in conjunction with Bartles Beach. So if we go to this top left photo here, this is what would become Bartles Beach, or is Bartles Beach here. You actually see some of these larger trees, which I would like to think are some of the same trees. That would be pretty neat. But you do actually see Rock Lake in the distance here, and you do see this, mowed, maintained, manicured area, which would be Bartles Beach. So we would be standing near Ferry Drive currently looking into Bartles Beach from the south side. This is the actual culvert tube, this corrugated metal tube, of which Ferry Drive would be created over the top of this culvert. And this would be a portion of the channel as well, with those concrete edges being done. So water access was shut off and dewatered to actually complete this construction project. And again, this is when the dam was created itself at its current location.
Do we know, is the current culvert the original culvert from the 50s? Or do we know of any replacements of the
I believe it was
bridge?
updated. I'd actually have to look again. I tried to find some information on it as well, but I know Ferry Drive has been redone, obviously, within those time frames. But I believe that culvert was redone at some point. It was not done when the new pedestrian bridge or newer pedestrian bridge was put in. So it wouldn't be recently.
Yeah.
But to give you some scope as well, this is prior to water being in here, obviously. But if you see these two men underneath the culvert tube itself as well, it gives you some scope as to how large this culvert tube actually is. And this photo with this dozer is actually the opening of like an earthen dam to allow water to flow back through this channel. So this would be on the right, Bartles Beach, on the left going towards some southern residences. At this point, they are allowing the water to flow through this channel and through the culvert back into the mill pond. Now, we are assuming that this is the 1950s. The portion of seawall that we are planning on replacing at Bartles Beach was also done during this concrete forming process, so it was done approximately this time as well. So they did pretty substantial concrete forming processes during this project. So, What we have here is basically going to our present time as far as acreage. I did go off of some past aerials. The furthest back that I can go back in reliable sourced aerials, when they actually did flyovers and take GIS, or I suppose geographical data, was approximately 1992 is the best one that I could come up with that I could actually measure acreage off of. And it was surprisingly similar to what exists now off of this aerial. We do have some encroachment of these marsh grasses into the mill pond, mostly near Veterans Lane and coming out a little bit near where my cursor is here. But 6.78 acres is what I could measure currently in a 2023 aerial of water body access, 11.07 acres being the marshy area. If I overlaid these onto as many older existing maps as I can find, obviously they're not all going to be the same scale, but they seemed as close as I could reasonably justify. They seem surprisingly accurate or comparable for the most part. So currently, is there any questions up to this point? No? So when we do reference our actual strand dredging feasibility study, when specifically Mill Pond is being referenced, I do want to clarify what was within that study is not 17.85 total acres, including the marshy area. It is just approximately the 6.78 acres of water body. Hopefully that was fairly interesting. So this gives me actually the great point too, the areas where I am kind of missing some information approximately in the 50s, and then from 1897 to 1915 I would love to find more data, and if anybody else has that available I'd like to pick out some more certain dates. But this is as close as I could make the assumptions from the sources that I had. But what we do have currently on the mill pond is the acreage there on our 2023 aerial. We have 2 fishing piers on the mill pond itself. One exists at Bartles Beach near Ferry Drive, near that culvert tube, and we have one behind Legion Post 67. Fishing pier is basically a fishing pad that I like to call it. We do have one on the channel, however, I'm excluding the channel from that inclusion as we're just referencing that 6.78 acres of area there. There are 2 pier boat access locations on Veterans Lane itself. There was the development of a walking and hiking trail, which you can actually see somewhat here. If we actually look at our Ferry Street Bridge somewhere up here, the access is along here, goes along this wooded path area around the south part of the mill pond, up into Veterans Drive, and there is what remains of a boardwalk access going east to west along the mill pond itself. There was also another, I suppose I could call it a non-motorized watercraft pier. It was basically just a small pier that came off of Bartles Beach side of the parking lot that was removed this year. That's the one that had the damaged timbers on the frame itself. But that's the conclusion that I can draw is 6.78 acres of, I suppose, water body access. I'm going to say that rather than the navigable at the point because navigability definitely depends on water depth. And what they previously referenced as head, that distance basically between the top of the silt and the top of the wire. So what I would like you guys to look at as we move forward as well is there were some documents that were provided to you to kind of help give some scope to some of the things that we are referencing and a blow up of what this OPCC is. That OPCC is Objective Project Construction Costs. Or opinions of projected construction costs, my mistake. And what this is, upon the request from you guys, is the updating of likely costs of some of the referenced options within Strand's dredging feasibility study and adjusted for inflation and construction cost on percentages for the most part. So this was Dwayne doing as much assistance as he could with the numbers that he had to provide updated costs for 2023 and moving forward. And if there are any questions regarding some of those things, the actual line items that are referenced, I can definitely answer some questions as well. I know one of the questions that I did receive, I think it was from Bernie, was, what does the 50-foot channel mean? There was an additional supplemental document that I sent in the agenda packet as well that outlines what that 50-foot channel is projected to be. If you guys do have the dredging feasibility study, that would be on page 33 of that study that does outline it fairly a little bit easier. But along with this OPCC, the actual dredging or potential project costs for this, I did provide you a small opinion of Chief Jason Russ of the fire department, comparing and contrasting their current response times to a lake emergency response, as well as the potential response times if there were to be permanent boat access or on-water access for the fire department, because the installation of some permanent boat lifts was projected within the actual feasibility study as well for potential future uses. And other than that, I'm more than happy to answer any other questions that you guys may have.